All right, so in the secular church, you get a lot of influence from the monastic church. They're interconnected. The bishops are supposed to be overseeing the monasteries. They're certainly relating to them, even though many of the monasteries have these charters granting them independence. And the monasteries are one of the places where you may get people tapped to become new bishops. That's another area, right? Bishops tend to come either up through the cathedral clergy, especially the archdeacons, who are kind of the officials responsible for church business and property. They're sort of equipped to step into the role. But if you want sort of someone with more of a reputation for sanctity, more of a sort of a moral man and a holy man, you'll often go to a monastery and pull a monk or an abbot of a monastery to step into the bishop's chair and take on that kind of a role. Now, this concern that you get characteristic of the monasteries, where people are worried about corruption, worried about monasteries not living up to their original ideals, the same thing pretty soon starts carrying over into secular churches, right, into cathedrals and parish churches, particularly among the bishops. Um, because partly just because the model, the mind frame, right, the reforming ideal carries over. That's going to be one area where you're going to get it. The other thing is that um, sorry, lose track of it. You get particular kinds of concerns in the secular churches around practices they call simony, which had been condemned from pretty early on, back in the days of the late Roman Empire and imperial Christianity. When the church started to become wealthy and powerful, you start getting anxieties over simony. It had always been condemned from time to time, but you get a really large scale concern over it in the 10th and 11th centuries. Um, Simony refers to the buying and selling of church offices, people becoming clergy for money. Right, that's the basic idea. Um, you get some cases where you would have just completely egregious, cases where an old bishop dies, they're going to choose the new bishop, and some nobleman goes around just paying people off to, nominate him and support him to become the new bishop, and just really egregiously trying to buy the office, or paying off the other bishops around who have a role in choosing and consecrating a new bishop, and making sure that they will support them for bishop. Other times it's a little more subtle. Remember that you've got noble families very much interlinked with these churches. They've planted their children in the churches that are growing up in them and being groomed for leadership. They're major donors to the churches. It's rather natural to expect that if you have a wealthy noble family and one of their nephews is rising through the church and gets chosen for bishop, that the family will gratefully respond by making a major donation to the church to celebrate the honor that's been given to a member of their family. Is that choice of a donation simony? Have they just bought the church? Have they bought the church office and are paying people off for supporting them? Is it, more genuine piety? How do you gauge that, right? But a lot of people are concerned that this kind of thing is corrupting the church, that it's become to be too much, being done around monetary issues. So simony is a major concern. Now, the thing is that bishops are, right, sort of the highest authority over their local churches. They gather in councils. If the bishop himself has become bishop by simony, how do you find an authority who can judge that and will have the authority to remove, to judge and remove a bishop who has committed a sin or, a crime against canon law like simony? And the answer that they'll turn to is the Pope down at Rome. Um, the papacy has had a long, gradual evolution. Okay. Uh, Back in the days of the Roman Empire, when you had disputes over theology and trying to figure out what's, Orthodox Christianity, what's, the sort of truest form of Christianity, one of the major arguments that the side that wound up winning would appeal to was the idea of apostolic succession, the idea that you're going to have the truest doctrine where you have a bishop who can trace his predecessors back to the apostles. If you could trace a chain of successors from an apostle to a bishop, to a bishop, to a bishop, to a bishop, down to the present guy, that's going to hand down the true teaching, and so you can count on that guy having truer doctrine. So apostolic had been very important, and Rome had always been very important because it has the most prestigious and most unquestioned claim to apostolic succession, where the popes claim to be the successors of St. Peter, and to pick Peter as, who's sort of, among the apostles, and Peter getting treated as the original bishop of Rome, right? So originally you had a bishop of Rome who was a bishop of his city, the same as any other bishop is a bishop of any other city, but the bishop of Rome takes on this additional prestige because he could claim his line back to St. Peter. Of course, Rome also is Rome. It's the imperial city, right? So that's going to be something that's also going to boost the prestige of the bishops of Rome. It's a very large city, and it's the church there is a very large and wealthy and powerful church, so the Rome has a lot of resources to throw around. It allows you a very large, powerful church, lots of charitable work going on, lots of clergy coming up through its ranks. So that's going to give it a certain prestige as well. And there's also, especially as far as Western Europe goes, another dimension. Back in the days of the late Christian Roman Empire, um, 5 bishops had been made patriarchs, kind of to honor them above the other bishops and create a sort of a group of senior bishops among all the other bishops. The 5 patriarchs were Alexandria in Egypt, Jerusalem, of course, because Jerusalem is Jerusalem, Antioch in Syria. Antioch and Alexandria were in the Eastern Mediterranean 2 of the oldest and most prestigious cities and bishops' cathedrals. Constantinople, because it was the city of the first Christian emperor and, the capital of the Eastern Empire. And then Rome, right, because Rome is Rome, and you have the successor of St. Peter there. So these 5, if you paid attention to the geography, 4 of the 5 are in the Eastern Mediterranean. They're part of the Byzantine Empire, right? In the Western part of the Roman Empire, so Western Europe we're talking about here, the only patriarch is Rome, right? So in terms of church office, church prestige, and the sort of just sheer ranking of the bishops, as far as the Western bishops are concerned, Rome is the patriarch that they all look up to. The word patriarch means father, and the term papa that we get pope from actually is also another term, means father, right? So it's sort of the father of the church at Rome that all the others look up to. What exactly that means, what that seniority implies, is something that nobody was really dealing with in too much detail. But there is a sort of overall sense that Rome has more prestige, more authority than anybody else in some sense. Under Charlemagne's time, as we saw talking beforehand, you get this sense, an additional sense, that Rome is the benchmark of proper Christianity, right? Sort of universal Christianity, as Charlemagne is trying to create a universal Christian church through his entire empire. He looks to Rome to set the norm. You use Roman books. When you have a dispute, you take it to the Pope as a sort of final judge. If you have a dispute over theology or church law or something like that, the Pope will be the final judge to handle that dispute. So Rome takes on a particular additional authority in that sense, right? What happens after the year 1000 is a further step, and probably in some ways to the highest level it's going to get to. Looking for an authority that you can pit over against simoniacs, over against simony, somebody who can judge a bishop, depose a bishop, right? Remove a bishop from office, discipline a bishop. You want somebody who outranks a bishop, and the answer is the Pope, right? The only candidate to play that role is going to get the Pope to play that role. And so you get movements to elevate the authority of the Pope from being not just a benchmark of orthodoxy, not just sort of the most prestigious and senior among equals, but as an actual tangible authority figure, as a kind of a monarch over the church, the way that a king is monarch over his kingdom, right? A ruler over the church. This is a set of movements we call often the Gregorian Reform. A number of steps to it. In 1054, you get the creation of the College of Cardinals, so that a pope can be chosen without interference from outside factors, but a group of churchmen alone will be responsible for selecting the pope. That's supposed to insulate this from outside influence and make sure that the church is choosing its own leader. It's called a Gregorian Reform after Pope Gregory VII, who is sort of going to pursue this agenda very aggressively of promoting papal authority and particularly going after simony and other kinds of issues that are associated with it. He's very concerned about violations of clerical celibacy, because what if you have the son of a priest? What sort of inheritance does he get? Does that take away from the church? That kind of a thing. So the Gregorian Reform. Now, the problem here, and what some of your texts are referring to, and this is to set the context for the Pope and Emperor documents that you have, The problem here is that you have rulers in Europe who are still pretty much ruling in Carolingian style, right? Where church and kingdom, church and emperor are closely intertwined. The emperor relies on the church for his legitimacy. In Germany in particular, in the empire, the Holy Roman Emperor, if you want to use that title, it's a little bit earlier than they really start using it, but the emperor there is he's got a number of sort of very large, powerful, noble principalities, Saxony and Bavaria and so forth. And in order to have the wealth and the power to ride herd on all of them and keep them from just totally splitting up, he relies on large, powerful bishops, right? The bishops sort of rule very large dioceses in Germany. They've got an awful lot of wealth. They're not hereditary positions, and so the emperor maintains influence over who gets elected bishop, make sure it's people who are loyal to him, and that way you've got the wealth and power and prestige of these very mighty bishops supporting the emperor and enabling him to outweigh the powerful noblemen, right, the sort of electors and dukes of the various German territories. So he really needs that, and he needs to be able to appoint bishops. The problem is Pope Gregory VII takes a look at the emperor going around and choosing who will and won't be a bishop, and he says, this is simony. This is a violation of the sanctity of the church. This is a sin, and Gregory needs to stop investing bishops with their offices. So you get this debate called the investiture controversy, and the large documents that you have came out in the context of that controversy. Just to give you some background on what winds up happening in it, Gregory complains about the Emperor Henry IV going around appointing bishops. Henry does not comply, as you can see in the letters that you'll be reading. So Gregory winds up excommunicating Henry, that is to say, kicks him out of the church, says he's no longer a Christian, he's going to hell. And this creates major political problems. This strips Henry of his political legitimacy, right? He's a ruler he's emperor by the grace of God. Now all of a sudden he apparently doesn't have God's grace anymore. And this is a spark that sets off a lot of Henry's discontented noblemen to launch a rebellion against him. All of a sudden he has this huge civil war breaking out in Germany. Really sort of is a major problem for him, and he has problems with, getting enough people to cooperate to be able to fight it. So finally Henry is forced in 1070 to go up and meet with Gregory at a castle called Canossa up in the Italian Alps. It's winter, it's snowing. Henry takes the stance of a penitent, going to repent of his sins, stands in the snow outside the gates barefoot for 3 days, freezing. Finally, sort of puts Gregory on the spot. He is supposed to be the leader of Christianity, after all, which is supposed to mean forgiving people. So Gregory finally admits him in. Henry repents, Gregory forgives him, lifts the excommunication. Henry goes back to Germany and is able to get enough support to whip the rebels and regain control of Germany for his empire. Then Henry turns around and goes back to appointing bishops, just like he had been doing beforehand. Gregory turns around and excommunicates him a second time, but Henry has already cleaned up all the rebels in his kingdom, so this doesn't create anywhere near as much political trouble as he had before. He leads an army down into Italy, takes over Rome. Gregory flees into exile, winds up dying in exile in Sicily. With the words on his lips, I have hated iniquity and loved righteousness, and therefore I die in exile, rather tragic term. So it's kind of a very key moment. Later popes and later emperors resume the debate. They go back and forth. They wind up coming to compromises over it and sort of create the medieval order going forward. It's a very important episode, though, because it should illustrate a couple things. One, it reminds us how important religion is in the pre-modern world generally, and in medieval Europe in particular. The Pope is a very influential figure. The Pope can do an awful lot, and exert an awful lot of pull on events. On the other hand, it also reminds us that although popes are claiming more authority than ever as the heads of Christendom, there nevertheless are people who are prepared and capable of arguing with them and denying the claims of the popes and their claims to authority. And when push comes to shove, it is the kings who have the armies. The Pope has a little bit of soldiers, but nothing to compete with what the Emperor of Germany can bring against him. And so Sometimes when you hear cliches about the Middle Ages when everything is religious and it's all religious fanaticism and the Pope is some kind of a dictator who just orders everybody around and everybody has to obey whatever the Pope says to them, that's all really complete nonsense. That is not an accurate description of the Middle Ages at all. It's a negotiating game, right? The popes do have authority, they are powerful, they are influential, but not in an absolute sense. They wish they were. You read the Dictatus Papae that you have in your reader, you could see how they're trying to make a claim to be, but others are quite capable. Rulers, and for that matter, the rulers' own bishops that they are supporting, are quite capable of arguing back against popes and laying their own visions out for what they think the role of religion is in their society. So do bear that in mind. Okay, one last area to lecture, and that's intellectual life. Talk about the rise of scholasticism. Talking beforehand, when we talked about the early Middle Ages, how the church had been the sole surviving Roman institution that required literate people, and therefore took on the task of educating its own people. Back in the Roman Empire, you could just assume the people had learned, by being members of the ruling class. But in the Middle Ages, you can't assume that anymore. The church is setting up its own schools in order to train monks and priests to be able to read the Bible, read the Mass books, read canon law books, so on and so forth. And so the church had this role of literacy. And we saw in the Carolingian Renaissance, Charlemagne investing in churches, building new schools, expanding their literacy, expanding their education, standardizing learning, standardizing writing systems, and sort of overall elevating the sort of basic building blocks of creating a stronger educational system. As you get past the year 1000, this is going to snowball and explode, and education is going to increase all the more. There's a number of things going on. One, as kings are struggling to create their own power, they're needing more clerks. They're needing judges. They're needing administrators. They're trying to rebuild administration with literate people. Also, as bishops and popes are building up their own authority, they need the same thing, right? They need judges. They need clerks. They need archivists. They need people, notaries, and people to keep the records and keep the machinery of government operating on a larger scale than had been before. There are starting to be jobs again, careers to be made based on education, not just on your birth into a noble family. So education becomes a big deal, and that means that those schools that had been started in Charlemagne's time, attached to the various monasteries and cathedrals, are starting to get more and more students flocking into them. A lot of the kind of lower nobility, the noble families that are not the rulers, not the counts and dukes of whole territories, but just sort of small local viscounts and barons and minor nobles, they're starting to send more and more of their sons to these schools to get an education. Not so much with the idea that they'll become a priest or a bishop or a monk, but with the idea that they'll become a clerk, that they'll become a notary, that they'll become a judge. They'll take on one of these kinds of jobs. So there's a lot of that going on. The schools are burgeoning. They're needing more and more teachers. These students start coming through, they're setting up. And so you get the beginning of scholastic culture. You get certain areas, particularly where you have a lot of church schools in close geographic proximity to each other, where the whole thing starts developing a certain synergy, and the schools are all picking up off each other, the teachers are picking up off each other. You start getting people who can freelance even, and are starting to sort of set up shop in their own house and track students that they're going to train in rhetoric and dialectic and logic and all these other kinds of fields. And this whole thing starts taking off. Eventually, around the early 1200s, about the same time as the Franciscans are getting founded, somebody says, we got to start regulating this, we got to start organizing it, we got to start setting standards, we got to give somebody jurisdiction to handle all the teachers and all the students that are sort of building up in these centers. And so you get the first universities being founded. There's debate over which one is actually the very first. It's originally evolving gradually, so it depends on which document you point to, saying, before this you had a school, after this you have a university. When it's first evolving, there's a bit of, that those terms haven't really formed yet. So might be Bologna down in Italy, might be Paris. Those are sort of the main candidates. Once they get established as universities, then other schools elsewhere say, oh, we're going to have a university like they have at Paris, and you get the model spreading in other places. But the birth of the university system. And this is going to mean the rise of a particular intellectual culture associated with these universities, or these, earlier than that, schools becoming universities. It's called scholasticism. We can think about the sort of way scholasticism works through three figures that trace its evolution pretty neatly. And their names all start with A. First one is Anselm. Saint Anselm. He's a churchman first in France, and then later on he becomes Archbishop of Canterbury. Active in in the 11th century, sort of in the 1070s, 1080s, 1090s, around then. Saint Anselm has an interesting pair of works called the Monologion and the Proslogion, in which he's taking on the question of the existence of God. He finds a verse in the Book of Psalms that says, "The fool in his heart has said there is no God." And Anselm says, I want to have an answer for this fool, right? The kind of person who does not believe in God. Now, bear in mind, this is a religious era. Anselm has never met an atheist in his life. There aren't any in the Middle Ages. This is a hypothetical kind of question here, not something that's really pressing. But he says, can we develop a proof for the existence of God? And the key thing here is that Anselm says what he wants is, his sort of model is faith seeking understanding. In other words, he's not pretending that he's starting from a neutral point, or not saying that, I don't believe and I want to see what I could figure out using logic, but he says, all well and good that I have my faith, that I've been taught Christianity since my childhood, that I've been taught it by the church, I could take it on authority from the Bible, but Anselm says it would be better not just to believe in God on faith alone, but to also believe in God because I've arrived at an understanding of God using my reason. Okay, that's what faith-seeking understanding means. You start from faith, yes, but blind faith is not good enough. You want to make it better by bringing reason to bear as well, and understanding the truth of the things you believe by the use of reason. So this attempt to answer the fool who does not believe in God is Anselm's way of pursuing, faith-seeking understanding, trying to say, forget the Bible, forget what the church teaches, can I develop a proof that God exists just using my reason? What he comes up with is this. He says, okay, suppose we take the statement, God does not exist. Okay, take that as a statement. He says, okay, well, what do we mean by this term God? What does God refer to? And Anselm offers a definition of the word God. Anselm says God is that thing than which nothing greater can exist. Right? God is that thing than which nothing greater can exist. Nothing can exist that's greater than God. If you imagine the greatest thing possible, and then you can imagine something even bigger and better than that, then that's not God. The bigger and better thing is God, right? God is the greatest thing possibly imaginable, the greatest thing that you can conceive of. And he says, okay, so is it possible to logically say God does not exist? And he says, well, if you imagine the greatest thing possible not existing, then you can conceive of something greater than that, which is the greatest thing possible, existing, right? Because to exist is greater than not to exist, naturally. So Anselm says, therefore, by definition, God must exist. That's his conclusion. It's been much debated, and I'm not going to get into it for centuries since then. Is this a valid proof? Is it a valid line of reasoning? Probably any of you who are out there who are atheists did not suddenly just decide to believe in God, I realize. But the key thing here, what's new, is the idea that education is not just about, learning to understand the Bible and learning what the church teaches and learning just to understand it. It's about learning to use your reason in a critical sense and not just take it on authority, right? That's the key thing. Okay, second figure is a guy named Abelard. So first was Anselm, now we got Abelard. And Abelard is very much interested in ideas about logic. There's new texts coming in that are being translated from the Arabic works of Aristotle and things like that, and Abelard's gobbling this stuff up and thinking about logic a lot. And Abelard is concerned, again, about this issue of sort of the authorities, the books the church uses, the writings of the fathers and the writings of the Bible. And Abelard says, look, let's be honest, when you read a lot of these things, you're going to find a lot of these authorities that you're going to find contradictions in them, or at least things that look like contradictions. And therefore, it becomes the task of education, becomes the task of the intellectual to sort out all these contradictions. He writes a book called Sic et Non, sic not like the disease, S-I-C for Latin, basically means yes and no, Sic et Non, in which he takes sort of, okay, here's a question, and here's how these quotes from the Bible or from the church fathers or from whatever would appear to answer the question. Here's a bunch of other quotes that would appear to answer the question on the opposite side. Here's the ones that say yes, here's the ones that say no. Okay, what's the truth? And this is kind of designed as a school textbook. This is the way he taught his students. Okay, here is the question, does God exist or whatever? And then say, okay, Here's all the authorities to say one thing, here's all the authorities to say the other thing, go. Right? Argue it out, demonstrate, use logic to figure out what the truth of the matter is, compare the authorities, the various possible ways they might be interpreted, whether some of them might be false or wrong, what your reason tells you by itself, and draw out the argument, right? So developing this idea of rational, logical argument in order to resolve contradictions in the authorities that you receive in the religious tradition. Abelard is quite controversial. Sic et Non was a controversial book because Abelard did not give the answers in it. He just laid out the questions, laid out the apparent contradictions. Some of them, by the way, he didn't think actually were contradictions. He just thought they appeared to be, but you could find ways to square them with each other. But, people sort of accused him of, spreading heresy and spreading unorthodoxy. He had various other ideas that were controversial. He also got into personal trouble, was rather disreputable. He became a very sort of famous teacher around Paris. This is before Paris became a university. He was sort of set up as an independent tutor, basically. And a wealthy merchant thought it would be a great idea for his daughter, Eloise, to get this fancy new education. So he hired Abelard as a tutor for her. Unfortunately, things went in a direction that are not supposed to happen between teachers and students, and Eloise wound up pregnant. Abelard claims that he offered to marry her, but she didn't want to because she thought it would hinder his option for a career in the church later on. When her father found out about it, he rounded up a bunch of her other male relatives, some cousins and nephews and uncles and things, who burst on Abelard in the middle of the night and castrated him, which was pretty much the end of the romance. Abelard went off into monasteries after that, continued teaching. Eloise became a nun. Their child was named Astrolabe, which kind of shows their fascination with all the new science going on. Don't know what really happened to Astrolabe over the long run, but that's sort of the tragic story of Abelard. You read his writings, he's actually a rather arrogant individual, not very easy to like, so it's sad what happened to him, of course, but, not a very easy person to feel too sympathetic for. Okay, anyway, the third figure, looking now down to the 1260s, 1270s, is Thomas Aquinas. Who really was picking up on precisely the same kind of thing that Abelard was. This issue of, okay, we've got all this learning, we've got all the information in the Bible and the teachings of the Bible, we've got the teachings of the church tradition, church fathers, we've got all these writings from Greek philosophers and other ancient writers. There's been a lot of translation going on down in Spain from where the Muslim intellectuals are helping to translate a lot of Greek philosophical works and scientific works and mathematical works and medical works into Latin, and this is all sort of coming into Europe, and all these explosive new ideas and commentaries from Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd and these Muslim intellectuals all coming along with it. So, sorry, a little ding from my computer there. So Aquinas is wrestling with all this, much as Abelard had before him, and starts laying out a whole systematic method to work through it. It's actually based on Abelard's, and it's sort of what had been going on in the University of Paris since Abelard's time. You lay out a question, right? And then you lay out, okay, here are authorities, right? Quotes from authoritative texts, the Bible, church fathers, Aristotle, whatever, that appear to answer the question one way, right? It seem to answer yes to it. And then, however, here is the sed contra, the but on the other hand. Sed contra is Latin for but on the contrary. On the other hand, here is an authority, or more than one, which appears to answer it the opposite way, right? And here are all the authorities that appear to answer yes, here's the one that comes to answer no. Then, what Abelard did not do, but Aquinas does, Aquinas will write a section that says, I answer that. Right? And that's a key thing when you're reading Aquinas. I've had students get very confused and say, Aquinas doesn't make any sense and he contradicts himself because first he says one thing and then he says the opposite. No, Aquinas is not contradicting himself. That's when you don't read it carefully. First he's laying out the arguments on one side of the issue, then he's laying out the argument on the other side of the issue, then you got to identify the part where he says, I answer that. And then he will lay out his solution to the problem, which usually is going to wind up agreeing with a second authority, the said counterpart. That's what he usually does, is finds a way to agree with that, or at least to rejigger it in a way that he would agree with it. So that's kind of the core section, how he himself answers the question. And then he'll go back and he'll have reply to objections. He'll have a section where he'll say, okay, that first one I quoted, it's wrong because of this. Or the second one I quoted, when you read it in context, it actually refers to something different. And this third one, can be taken in two senses. And if you take it in the first sense, it contradicts what I'm saying. But if you take it in the second sense, it actually agrees with what I'm saying. He'll sort of go through the objections that way in order to sort of explain how you ought to properly understand all the objections that appear to say the opposite. So this becomes the scholastic method, right? Compare the authorities, use reason to choose between them, or sometimes to sort out a whole new path not suggested by any of them, in order to bring reason to bear, to bring logic to bear on the solution to all kinds of theological and philosophical and other kinds of questions. Okay, so that's what scholasticism is all about. It really is pretty radical because, for the time, if you look back to, say, Roman learning, it had tended to be very conservative in character. It tended to look backwards and say the wisdom of the ancients is the best, and we aim to preserve that and maintain that. Medieval scholasticism does have that conservative tendency, but it's starting to shift and start saying, well, we're finding, yes, the ancients are very wise people, but they can't have been perfect because they disagreed with each other. It's up to us, and it's up to our powers of reason to sort out what the actual truth is between them, right? There's a rather obscure scholastic writer who sort of made a famous line about that to describe this phenomenon, where he said, we, us medieval scholastics, we are like dwarfs standing on the shoulders of giants, right? We are not as great as they are, but sometimes we see farther than they do, right? Which is sort of a great, I think, term for capturing the sense of what medieval scholasticism is all about. It's got that conservative quality. The ancient writers, the ancient authorities are the giants who are wiser than we are today. But because we could get up on their shoulders, we may get the chance to maybe see things that they did not see, understand things that they didn't. And that's very important as the legacy of medieval scholasticism. Thank you, everybody. Sorry we didn't have class this time. I will see you back on Tuesday after the weekend. Bye.